the past 25 years has been much, much better for British boxing than the previous 75 years. The number of champions that we've had in Britain, including at heavyweight, the number of Olympians has risen exponentially in the past 25, you could say even 30 years. What's the reason for this? Well, as with most things, there are potentially many reasons, but I firmly believe that one of the main reasons that there's been this shift in fortunes for British boxing and a shift for the better is because there's been a shift in attitude. The mind controls the body. Now, when I was growing up in the 80s, early 90s, Brits were still a lot more conservative back then than they are now. The stereotypical stiff upper lip and all that, that was a lot more evident in British society than what we see today. But along with that social conservatism was also, and obviously, a lot of the social conservatism fell away through the 60s and all that kind of stuff, but there was still a fair degree of it in British society in the 80s. But along with that conservative nature was also a lack of confidence. Now, some people say that, and perhaps they're right, after the British Empire fell, the nation really experienced a confidence crisis because so much of the pride that Britain had was as a result of building this big empire. And who replaced Britain as the dominant power in the world after World War II? Well, it was the United States. Now, in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, confidence is exemplified by braggadociousness, by being cocksure and perhaps a bit arrogant. This is usually symptomatic of somebody who's confident. Now, sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's somebody who is actually very insecure and they're trying to compensate for the insecurity by pretending to be confident. That happens too. But also, you can actually talk yourself confident. I've spoken about this in previous videos where Muhammad Ali, of course, was very brash and arrogant. But going into the Sonny Liston fight, by all accounts, he was scared to death privately. But he talked himself confident. It's like you fake it till you make it. If you tell yourself something, affirmations, if you tell yourself something enough times, you might actually start to believe it. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, right? The way you think about yourself is the way you become. So it predates World War II, of course, but there was a change, I would say, with America after World War II, because prior to that war, the boxers coming out of the United States tended to be reserved publicly. They were not usually that brash. I mean, you look at Joe Louis, and obviously it's different with black boxers and all that kind of thing because of the social dynamics going on in America. But even with the white boxers, most of them were quite reserved and, by today's standards anyway. But after World War II, that changed. Going on into the 50s and certainly the 60s, then you had the emergence of these openly braggadocious, cocky, even openly narcissistic fighters. Muhammad Ali and many others who came after him. And then American boxing became characterized by cockiness, brashness, trash talking, right? Whereas in Britain, throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, even much of the 90s, Brits and British fighters were far more reserved. You had the odd one like Chris Eubank and, a few others, but compared to the Americans, British fighters were very reserved back in the days. And there was an inferiority complex going on there. There's no doubt about it. And some people would say, to some extent, there still exists a degree of inferiority complex with regards to British fighters looking at Americans and maybe even British people looking at American people across the board. There's still some semblance of inferiority complex among a lot of people. But it's not as pronounced as it used to be. Once British fighters got out of this mode of being humble in interviews and conservative and all this kind of stuff and started embracing confidence more, being outwardly confident, being cocky, there tended to be a lot more success. Now, correlation doesn't equal necessarily equal causation. It can be coincidental. But in this instance, I don't think it is. I think that the changing attitude, once British fighters and the boxing establishment started embracing confidence more, being outwardly confident and cocky, I think that helped to move British boxing forward and close the gap between British boxing and American boxing. That it is okay to be cocky and believe in yourself. Now look, not everybody who's cocky believes in themselves, and not everybody who's quiet doesn't believe in themselves. But generally speaking, certainly in something like boxing, the quieter fighters tend to be the ones who are not quite, the fighters who are more circumspect in terms of the things they say tend to be the ones who are not quite so sure of themselves as the ones who are outspoken. For example, Teofimo Lopez going into the Lomachenko fight, he was very brash and confident about what he was going to do. Well, you think that was just a front, or was he actually that confident? No, he was actually that confident. He spoke confident, and he went in there and he fought confident. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, in many amateur gyms, I experienced this. When a fighter would try to, a young amateur would try to emulate a Roy Jones, a Mike Tyson, a Muhammad Ali, they would often be admonished by the trainers who would say things like, "What are you trying to fight like an American for? We're not American here." That kind of backward thinking, rather than looking at what the Americans do well and say, well, we need to be emulating that, right? It's not rocket science. If the best fighters in the world are fighting in this particular way, then it's worth looking at what they're doing and seeing whether it works for us. Yeah, at least try it, rather than just discourage all the amateurs in your gym from even attempting it. Oh, that's silly. Get your hands up. Stop fighting with a low left hand. George Groves talked about this. I think David Hayes even talked about this when they were coming up in the amateurs, what the coaches would tell them. Keep your hands up. Back in the days, the typical British style was kind of more modeled on the Eastern European amateur style of standing very straight up and like fencing with the left hand and, leaning back and all this kind of stuff. Very robotic. And that's how they were teaching people to fight in the gym. That's how Richie Woodall, for example, used to fight. And even Anthony Joshua's head coach, Rob McCracken, he used to fight like that. Very upright, leaning back and, stiff style. That's what they used to teach. And anybody who came in there trying to do a Roy Jones impression, for the most part, the trainers were admonishing you, ridiculing you for doing that. Think about how backward that is. And also, anybody who was trying to trash talk and be cocky, that's American. Why are you trying to act American? The cockier British fighters have become, the more outwardly cocky, the more successful they've become. And I think that the cockiness and the success go hand in hand. You don't necessarily have to be cocky to be successful, but it's symptomatic of being inwardly confident in most instances, certainly for boxing. So I think that the American exceptionalism, which was present, before World War II, but after World War II, perhaps even more so, the proliferation worldwide of Americana, which the whole world seemed to fall in love with, Coca-Cola and McDonald's and all this kind of stuff, which we see as terrible now. It was all the rage, it was the coolest thing in the world. Back in the 60s and the 70s and all that kind of stuff, in places like the Middle East, they loved all the Americana. Certainly in the Caribbean, in the Far East, people loved it all. I mean, people still love America now, but it was even more so back then. Trust me. But it was the exceptionalism that people gravitated towards, the confidence that Americans exuded, very brash about themselves and what have you. This is the stereotype that British people always had about Americans. They're very brash and cocky and arrogant and all this kind of stuff. Well, yeah, maybe that's an aspect of how confident they are. Maybe that's an indication of the way they feel about themselves inside. And maybe there's something to be learned from that. You could talk yourself confident, use affirmations, and so on. And if you're in a sport like boxing, this is an alpha male sport. They call it a gentleman's sport, but I mean, beating somebody until they're unconscious is not really a gentlemanly thing to do, is it? So I'm more realistic about boxing. I don't see it as a gentleman's sport. Obviously, you have rules and all this kind of business, but ultimately, boxers are harnessing their primal instincts That's what they're doing. They're cultivating their primal instincts as well as their rational, logical thinking mind to come up with strategy where they can channel their primal instincts in the most effective way. But ultimately, you're still dealing with primal instincts. This is why I don't get so outraged when people like Deontay Wilder are coming out talking about catching bodies and all this kind of bit. I don't get outraged by stuff like that because I'm realistic about what boxing is. Boxing is savagery. Yeah. It was once described as theater with blood because of the drama and the theatrical nature of boxing a lot of the time. But this is brutal. Let's not kid ourselves about what boxing is. It's controlled, I guess, to some degree, sanitized brutality, but it's still brutality. And as such, there are going to be people, even at very high, in fact, probably even more so at high levels in boxing, who have brutal mentalities, who if they came out and were honest with you about what their intentions were, stepping in the ring, what they want to do to their opponent, there'd be an outcry like there was with Deontay Wilder, because a lot of people just don't understand the environment and the mindset that many people have in that environment, the mindset they feel like they need to have to be able to succeed in that environment. This is why Deontay thinks the way he does, because he's not a Mayweather who can just be cool and lay back and, do his thing. No, when he's in there, he feels like he's fighting for his life. He feels like it's a life and death thing. And in his mind, it's not going to be me who's going out on a stretcher. It's going to be you. It puts him into that kind of fight or flight, do or die mentality. That's what Wilder has. So I understand that mentality. Mike Tyson had a similar mentality. George Foreman had a similar mentality. Again, this is a theme with these very, very historically devastating punches. Many of them have a very vicious mentality when compared to a more technical boxer. The bad intentions that Customado used to talk about are really bad intentions. That's why Customado wasn't specific when he talked to the public about what the bad intentions actually are. He left that ambiguous. Mike Tyson was more specific. Mike Tyson said he was trying to catch bodies because many of the fighters who Tyson looked up to had caught bodies in the ring. And when he was a young fighter, he wanted that on his resume too. So when I hear stuff like this, do I want that to happen in the ring? Of course I don't. That's why you have referees and cornermen and doctors who can stop a fight in most cases before it gets to that. But I'm not shocked that many fighters think in this way. And it's far more than have come out and publicly admitted it. I'm not shocked at all. I understand. In this kind of environment, alpha male environment, do or die mentalities, that kind of thing, people are going to have a lot of extreme thoughts in their heads. Yeah. But going back to what I was saying earlier with regards to the confidence, the cockiness, in my view, is a symptom, if that's even the right term to use. It's probably a more appropriate term than symptom. But the cockiness is a symptom of how confident they are inside in most cases with fighters. And you can see when a fighter is not quite as confident as they're making out to be, usually. But in some instances, when a fighter just truly believes it, they truly believe what they're saying in terms of their cocky, you can also see that. So, yeah, that's my view, my theory on not necessarily why, but how British fighters became more successful over the past 25 years than they were for the previous 75, at least on the world stage. Now, obviously, you can bring in things like the fact that there's a lot more belts nowadays and so on. But just look at the heavyweight division alone. Britain didn't get a look in the heavyweight division for nearly 100 years between Bob Fitzsimmons, and a lot of people say, well, he's not really British. He was born in Britain, but weren't he living in New Zealand most of his life, or Australia, whatever it was? Some people say that Brits can't even claim him. But if you do count Bob Fitzsimmons as British, then it was nearly 100 years between him being world heavyweight champion and then Lennox Lewis in, when was it, 1992, 93? Nearly 100 years. Bob Fitzsimmons was world heavyweight champion in 1897. And Lewis, I think, was 92 or 93 when Riddick Bowe relinquished his WBC belt, and Lewis, who was mandatory challenger at the time, was elevated to full champion. So Britain really weren't getting a look in the heavyweight division. But look at it now. I mean, British heavyweight boxing has never been stronger than it is right now. Never. In the history of Queensberry rules pugilism, British heavyweight boxing has never been stronger than it is now. And of course, some people are going to say it's only because American boxing is not as strong as it used to be. I don't buy that. American boxing isn't as strong as it used to be, and heavyweight boxing specifically. But you look at the talent we have at the moment, right, in the heavyweight division. You take Lennox Lewis out of the equation, because Lewis is still regarded, and rightly so, as the best heavyweight Britain has ever produced. You take Lewis out of the equation. Name me British heavyweights who would have come and dominated the guys we have now. What, Frank Bruno? Nah, bro. I know there are a lot of Bruno fans out there who want to tell you that, he would have destroyed Anthony Joshua and Dylan White and all these guys. I'm not saying he wouldn't have been competitive. I mean, he was competitive against Lennox Lewis. But if I was to pick between Anthony Joshua and Frank Bruno, I'm picking AJ all day. He's way more talented, way more versatile than Frank Bruno. Way more athletic. People compare him to Bruno. I don't see where the comparisons are, to be honest with you. Other than maybe, they're both big black guys and muscular, right? Although AJ's bigger than Bruno. Taller anyway. Yeah, you could say they're stiff. Bruno was way stiffer than AJ. Way stiffer than AJ. AJ's way faster than Bruno, way more versatile. Fights on the inside, on the outside. Just way more dynamic than Bruno. Bruno's very basic. Don't get it twisted. He had a very good jab. He could punch hard. Probably had a better chin than AJ, truth be told. Bruno's issue was more, and AJ shares a similar issue, where he takes a long time to recover from being hurt, but you seldom saw Bruno's legs go funny the way AJ's legs went funny when he got hit by Andy Ruiz, or get dropped as heavily as he did against Klitschko, or have his legs wobble the way they did in the Dylan White fight. Yeah, Frank Bruno did wobble a few times, Jumbo Cummins, and obviously Tyson stopped him. But yeah, for my money, Bruno probably had a bit of a better chin than AJ, and he had a very strong jab, although it was a slow jab. But all round, AJ's a much better fighter than Frank Bruno. Dylan White, for me, I would take him over Frank Bruno as well. Frank Bruno lost to guys like Tim Witherspoon, Bone Crusher Smith, guys who took him into deep water and drowned him. And Bruno had success against both those guys, particularly Bone Crusher Smith. But ultimately, he couldn't stay the pace. And somebody as tenacious as Dylan White, I think, would stop Bruno late on in the fight. It'd be a good fight. Maybe Bruno's ahead. But the bottom line is, I look at the guys around today. Tyson Fury, for example. Are you picking Frank Bruno over Tyson Fury? I'm definitely not. No way am I picking Frank Bruno. I mean, Vladimir Klitschko does everything better than Frank Bruno, and he's bigger. And Tyson Fury beat him. No way I'm picking Frank Bruno over Tyson Fury. And who else was there? Gary Mason, R.I.P. He ain't beating Tyson Fury or Anthony Joshua right now, in my view. Probably not even Dylan White. The Dylan White fight, Gary Mason would have a decent chance. Even Bruno would have a decent chance against Dylan White. But I just feel like the tenaciousness will be enough to deal with Bruno. And I feel like a bit more versatility will be able to deal with Gary Mason. And either way, even if you think that Bruno and Mason could beat Dylan White, and maybe Bruno would have a chance against AJ, look at the depth that we have in terms of heavyweight talent now compared to then. So, yeah, to me, this is indicative of an injection of confidence, a shift in mentality among British boxers, whereby the attitude now is we can do exactly what the Americans can do. We can be just as confident as them. We can be just as cocky as them. We can fight in the same styles that they fight in. It's no problem. British fighters are not limiting themselves anymore to one particular style. And that's the interesting thing about British boxing, actually, is that during the 90s, you had the Ingle gym, for example, the Eubank gym. They really, I think, helped a lot in terms of breaking the old British boxing traditions, breaking the mold and introducing more fluidity into British boxing. Of course, with Prince Nassim and what have you, Harold Graham and so on. I think that they really helped a lot. They made it more acceptable, that Brendan Ingle, Eubank gym, they made it more acceptable to fight in a flashy, hands down, fluid style. And, once that happened, especially with Prince Nassim, Harold Graham to a lesser degree, but Prince Nassim, of course, went a lot further and was more successful than Harold Graham. And you got a lot of people trying to emulate him. Loads of British fighters were trying to fight like Prince Nassim, wearing the same kind of shorts and all this kind of business. I think Carl Froch and several other fighters that came the generation after Prince Nassim said that they were inspired by him. So, yeah, and of course with Prince Nassim, the cockiness, the arrogance, the brashness, right? That was an American thing, but Prince Nassim was doing it. And that a lot of people, this is the funny thing, a lot of people in the 90s, when Prince Nassim first rose to prominence, he was fighting on ITV, before he'd won a world title. The reaction I saw from a lot of Brits was a hostile one towards Prince Nassim. Now, some people are going to say, well, it's because of ethnic relations back then were worse than they are today. And that is true. But no, I also think it was the fact that Brits weren't used to their boxers being so brash and cocky as Prince Nassim was. And Prince Nassim, of course, was inspired by Muhammad Ali in terms of being brash and cocky. So, when he had all that success during the 1990s, and he was one of the top British fighters, if not the most highly regarded British fighter other than Lennox Lewis of the 90s, was probably Prince Nassim. Nigel Benn was very highly regarded. Chris Eubank was very highly regarded. But they weren't perceived as being as dominant as Prince Nassim. Okay. Now, if you want to go back and inspect the records of Nigel Benn and Chris Eubank, some of you may come to the conclusion that they were better fighters than Nassim was. But I'm talking about the attitude and the perception that the British public had at the time. And at the time, the perception of many is that Prince Nassim was the top guy other than Lewis. Yeah, and of course, Lewis ended up losing, right? He got knocked out by Oliver McCall and later on Hasim Ratman. And certainly after the McCall loss, there may have been a period when Prince Nassim was the guy, where he was seen as better. Lewis was knocked out by McCall in 94. Can't remember where Nassim was in his career at that point, but he didn't win the world title back until at least a couple years later. And even then, a lot of people in Britain still really didn't quite believe in Lennox Lewis. So Prince Nassim was seen as the man for a certain period in the 90s in British boxing because he was batting up everybody that he stepped in the ring with. The British fighters, he smashed them to pieces. The American fighters like Tom Johnson smashed him to pieces. Puerto Rican fighter like Wilfredo Vasquez smashed him to pieces. All these international names. And he was doing it in style with flair, So it took a while for the British public to really warm to somebody that cocky. I think Eubank Senior helped, and he was also a heel in the eyes of the British public for a long time. They booed him and hissed and stuff like that when he got into the ring because they just weren't used to that kind of cockiness. It was really associated with Americans. And Eubank Senior, of course, learned how to box in America. He didn't learn how to box in the UK. He was sent by his dad to go live with his mum in the Bronx, and that's where he learned how to box. In the tough gyms out there in New York City. New York City, very different place now to what it was in the 1980s. But Eubank went out to the Big Apple, New York City, and learned how to box there. And I think he probably brought some of that braggadociousness from those gyms in his own way, because Eubank Senior fancied himself as some kind of British aristocrat. So he was cocky as a caricature of a British aristocrat, as like the quintessential eccentric English gentleman, this archetype that exists or that existed in British culture, the eccentric English gentleman. He took that and created a WWE pantomime version of it. And in fact, there's a character in the video game Street Fighter. I can't remember what he's called now, but he's like a British pugilist. I forget his name, but I feel like part of the inspiration for that character came from Eubank Senior. I could be wrong, but I feel like part of it did. Anyway, the confidence that Eubank Senior had, he wore on his sleeve, same as Prince Nassim. And that inspired a new generation of British boxers who weren't reserved like the previous generations, the Frank Brunos and the Henry Coopers and people like that. No, they weren't reserved. They were cocky. It inspired the likes of George Groves, David Hay. It inspired the likes of Tyson Fury even, the cockiness and the brashness. Now, obviously, Tyson Fury would have been inspired by many people, American fighters. But the fact that there were British fighters before him that were doing the whole cocky, brash thing, and also the style they were fighting in with the hands down and the flair and pizzazz. I'm not saying specifically for Tyson Fury, but for people like him, other British fighters that came after, they would have felt like it's okay now to be cocky like an American. Because Eubank did it, Prince Nassim did it, so we can do it too. It's okay now to fight with your hands down in this fluid American style. We can do this now without being ridiculed. Now, some of the, I'm going to call it backward thinking in British boxing still exists in the gym, the amateur gyms especially, but even still a lot of the professional gyms, where they have this mentality that Brits are supposed to fight in a very conservative kind of way. But then you've got more forward-thinking trainers like Shane McGuigan, who I rate highly, and also like Ben Davison. I know Ben Davison gets a lot of flack. People make fun of the stuff he says and they feel like he's begging it and all this kind of business. But Ben Davison is a good boxing analyst, and I think he's a good trainer. Again, his personality and the way he comes across might not be for everybody, but from all I've heard him say and all the work I've seen him do, he's a more progressive, forward-thinking trainer than the traditional British trainer. You know, he's more in the mode of a Shane McGuigan than one of the old school guys, George Francis or somebody like that, right? Even a Robert McCracken, who I see as an old school trainer. The Shane McGuigans of the world and the Ben Davisons are more forward-thinking than that. Their minds are more open than that, in my view. So anyway, just some musings regarding British boxing and why it has changed so dramatically for the better. I'm sure I could add on to it and find different reasons for this shift in fortunes, but a large part of why British boxing has become more successful is the attitude change. The style change, the attitude change, embracing cockiness, embracing confidence, embracing eccentricity to some degree, but basically just doing what the Americans were doing for decades prior, you know? Realizing that, well, they must be doing something right, so let's try and emulate what they're doing. Let's try and learn from them. Doesn't mean we have to be exactly like them, but we can take the things they do well and incorporate that into what we do. It only makes sense to learn from whoever the best is. Yeah? It doesn't mean you have to become a clone. In fact, you can improve on what they do. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Just some musings. I could go on and bring different factors into the equation, which also resulted in British boxing having this upswing in fortunes, but maybe I'll say that for another day. Let me know how you guys feel in the comments below. I'm out. Come and join me on Patreon and access my weekly no-holds-barred, censorship-free podcast where we lift the lid on a wide range of controversial topics. It's not mainstream friendly, it's not politically correct, but that's the whole point. We dare to stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. Just head on over to my Patreon page and select the tier called Hatman Hot Topics. You'll gain access to a minimum of 2 hours of exclusive content every single week, including podcasts, videos, interviews, live stream Q&A sessions, as well as my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Not to mention a vast back catalog of hundreds of hours of previous episodes. You can listen via the Patreon app with the option to download in high quality MP3. We've also got a Discord server where you can come and chat and hang out with myself and other members. There's no contract, no commitment, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.